At first, Estevanico was just a name on someone's inventory list. By the time he crossed the desert, people whispered he could cure the dying and call down rain. The man who arrived in chains left with a turquoise rattle and a reputation bigger than any conquistador. Imagine what it takes to convince not just strangers, but your captors, that you are something more than a body to be owned. There is a moment coming when Estevanico steps beyond survival, and it turns out that what he knows can upend the balance of power for everyone around him. If you are drawn to the stories where history pivots in the hands of those it tried to forget, subscribing helps make sure they actually get told. Your support lets us keep searching out these hidden lives, so the next time someone says legends are only for the powerful, you will know better. In the beginning, there was no legend, just a boy named Mustafa, growing up in the port city of Azemur, Morocco, when the world was shifting beneath his feet. The Atlantic tides carried news of war, and Portuguese ships brought the threat of conquest to his doorstep. The town's walls were old, but they could not hold back the future. Mustafa's father traded in the market. His mother stitched prayers into his tunic. He ran with other boys along the river, learning which reeds snapped loudest and how to read the sky for storms. The city was a crossroads, Berber, Arab, Portuguese, and Jewish merchants all crammed into narrow streets. So Mustafa heard many tongues before he ever saw a map. He learned to listen first and speak later, a habit that would one day save his life. Azemur was not free. It had fallen to the Portuguese, and the rules kept changing. Soldiers patrolled the alleys, collecting tribute in food or silver or sometimes people. There was hunger. Then came drought. In those years, the river shrank and the wells turned bitter, and Mustafa watched neighbors vanish from the market one by one. Some were taken by debt, some by force. He was a teenager when the knock came at his own door. He remembered the taste of salt from the tears on his mother's face when the men loaded him into the cart with others, bound for the fortress by the sea. He was not the first to be sold, and he would not be the last. No one asked what he wanted. In the records, he became a line item, un esclavo moro, joven fuerte, sold to a Spanish nobleman named Andrés Dorantes de Carranza. He was loaded onto a ship bound for Seville with a new name, Esteban, then Estevanico. They baptized him quickly, washing away Mustafa, and gave him a Christian medallion to wear. The water was cold, the words foreign. He learned to keep his real name hidden under his tongue, safe where no one could steal it. Spain was crowded and loud, and Estevanico was just another body among hundreds of enslaved people from Africa and the Mediterranean. He watched as others were sent to sugar fields or cities, but Dorantes had other plans. The Spanish were hungry for new lands. They talked of golden cities, wild rivers, and riches waiting just beyond the edge of the known world. When Dorantes signed on for the Narvaez expedition, Estevanico was included as property, an extra pair of hands, a body to carry supplies, nothing more. He listened to the Spaniards boast about conquest, but he knew the silence of those who had lost everything. At night he practiced Spanish under his breath, and by day he picked up scraps of Portuguese and Catalan from the crew. He learned to watch faces, not words. The fleet left port in 1527, 600-strong soldiers, sailors, indentured servants, enslaved men and women, wives, traders, cooks, all pressed together by hope and desperation. Estevanico was assigned no rank, no voice in decisions. He slept by the barrels in the hold, but he watched how the officers argued, how the priests blessed the voyage, how the horses grew nervous when the wind shifted. The Atlantic crossing was brutal. Storms battered the ships, men grew sick, food spoiled, and already the talk turned dark. Estevanico kept his head down. He learned who could be bribed for water, who would steal bread, who would betray a secret for a coin. In Cuba, the expedition rebuilt after the first hurricane struck. Estevanico saw men die for less than a loaf of bread. He saw how quickly the strong became weak. The Spanish officers still acted as if God favored them, but Estevanico recognized the fear in their voices. The second storm finished what the first began. When they finally landed near what is now Tampa Bay, Florida, the 600 had already shrunk. The land was green and hot, filled with insects and birds he did not know. Estevanico listened as the Spanish made plans, drew maps, and argued about the quickest way to gold. He was told to carry supplies, rowboats, dig trenches. He did as he was ordered, but his eyes stayed sharp. He marked which men had the best boots, which had the softest hands, and who whispered prayers in languages the priests did not recognize. Florida was a maze of swamps, rivers, and shadowed forests. The expedition splintered almost immediately. Illness, hunger, and skirmishes with locals wore them down. Estevanico saw the bodies pile up, saw leaders turn on each other. He saw that the rules of Spain did not matter here. Strength came from adaptation. He began to collect words from the people they met, piecing together the meaning behind gestures, tone, and silence. It was a skill the Spanish barely noticed, but the difference between a threat and a greeting could mean life or death. He carried this knowledge quietly, never letting anyone see how much he understood. He was still property, but property that paid attention. When the survivors built rafts to escape the swamps, Estevanico worked beside men who had once owned estates and commanded armies. Saltwater soaked his skin. The sun burned his back. The sea took most of them. He remembered the weight of silence after the screaming stopped, the way the horizon seemed to swallow hope. When the last raft washed ashore near the island, later called Malhado, only about 80 men remained, all broken, hungry, and lost. Estevanico looked at the survivors, conquistadors and servants, priests and thieves, and realized that for the first time, no one was in control. Hunger had leveled them all. The Karankawa people found them on the beach. The Spanish tried to command, to threaten, to pray for deliverance. It did not matter. Poisoned arrows and disease did what the ocean had not finished. More men died. Estevanico was taken with the others into captivity. He watched the Spanish faces crumble as the truth set in. Here, their swords bought nothing. The rules were not theirs to write. Estevanico listened to the words of the people who now held their lives in their hands. He noticed that the captors paid attention to skill, not birth. Those who could carve wood or sew or heal were kept alive. Those who could not disappeared. He found his opening in what he remembered from Azemur, the old women who cured fevers with plant roots, the men who sang prayers over wounds. He watched, learned, and adapted. He tried his hand at simple remedies, copying what others did. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it did not. But the attempt set him apart. He began to trade what he knew for scraps of food, for easier work, for time spent observing instead of laboring. He was learning a new kind of survival, one that depended on what he could offer, not who he had been. Among the captives, the Spanish began to turn to Estevanico for help. He could talk to the captors, barter for favors, interpret commands. He had no power by law, but he was becoming a bridge between worlds. The lines between owner and owned blurred in the mud and hunger. He started to realize that survival here would not come from obeying orders, but from making himself necessary to everyone, Spanish and indigenous alike. He kept this realization close, hidden. He was still a name on someone's list, but he was watching for the moment when that would no longer be true. That moment was coming, faster than the others could see. But before Estevanico could claim it, the world around him had to break just a little bit more. And when it did, the next choice he made would change not just his story, but the fate of everyone still left alive. Estevanico did not become a myth by accident. The shift began quietly, almost invisibly, as the power structure around him collapsed. It was not an act of rebellion or a single bold escape. It was the moment he realized nobody was watching the old rules anymore. The men who once barked orders at him now shivered on the sand, hungry and delirious, their boots rotting off their feet. The Karankawa kept them alive, but only barely. The Spanish titles, the crosses, the gold medallions, none of it counted for anything. Estevanico saw it first before even Cabeza de Vaca understood. When the world flips upside down, the things you know, the words you can trade, the stories you can tell, they become more valuable than a sword or a name. He did not try to run. Not yet. He watched. He waited. He listened to the way the Karankawa elders spoke to each other, the way they ignored the Spanish and tested the strangers with small tasks and impossible questions. He noticed who was given the better scraps of fish, who was allowed to sit by the fire. He saw that the people who survived in this place were the ones who learned fastest. He remembered the markets of Azemur, the old women who sold herbs and amulets, the men who could talk their way out of anything. He remembered how his mother's prayers sounded in the dark. What if those old words could mean something here too? It started with a sickness. One of the Spanish men, gaunt and feverish, could not get up from the ground. The Karankawa watched from a distance, their faces unreadable. The other Spaniards mumbled prayers, made the sign of the cross, but nothing changed. Estevanico crouched beside the sick man. He did not know the right remedy, he only remembered bits and pieces from home. He asked for permission to try. The Karankawa said nothing. He plucked a handful of bitter leaves he had seen the elders use, chewed them, spat them onto the man's chest, and sang a song in a language nobody else there understood. The Spaniards stared. The Karankawa watched with sharp eyes, their attention suddenly focused. The man did not die that night. In the morning the fever broke. The Karankawa did not thank Estevanico, but they sent a young girl to bring him water. Later, one of the elders let him sit closer to the fire. The other Spaniards began to whisper. They could not decide if he was lucky or dangerous. When another child fell ill, the Karankawa called for Estevanico. He hesitated, knowing that if he failed, things could turn quickly. He tried again, using the same rough method. This time the child lived. Word spread. The Karankawa began to treat him differently, not as a captive, but as someone with a role. The Spanish survivors saw it too. They started asking Estevanico to bargain for food, to ask for mercy, to explain what the Karankawa wanted. The line between slave and savior blurred almost overnight. But power, even borrowed power, is dangerous. Estevanico found himself watched from both sides. The Spanish feared he would turn fully native, that he would betray them if it meant freedom. The Karankawa were not sure if his cures were magic or luck. He knew one mistake could end everything. Yet each time he succeeded, the space around him widened. He was allowed to walk further, to gather his own food, to speak with more people. He learned new words, piecing together the Karankawa language from scraps. Silence was still his shield. But now, when he spoke, others listened. There was a moment when Cabeza de Vaca, the Spanish nobleman now stripped of rank and hope, asked Estevanico how he knew what to do. Estevanico shrugged. He did not explain that he had been watching for this chance since they landed. He did not say that he had been listening so long. He could already see how stories grew into something larger than any one person. He simply said he remembered things from home, and that sometimes old prayers worked in strange places. Cabeza de Vaca nodded. He did not ask again. Estevanico's new reputation as a healer spread beyond the camp. Other indigenous groups heard of him, and when traders passed through, they brought stories of a black man who could sing away fevers and interpret dreams. Some wanted to see for themselves, to test his power. Estevanico realized that being seen as more than a man, being seen as someone touched by spirits, was safer than being seen as just another captive. He leaned into it, carefully. He let the Karankawa believe he knew secrets from across the sea. He let the Spaniards believe he was their only hope of survival. When they moved to new camps, Estevanico was sent ahead to speak first. He negotiated gifts, safe passage, sometimes even food. The Spanish started to follow his lead, often without admitting it. By the time a year had passed, Estevanico had become the bridge no one could cross without him. He was no longer just the Moor in the Spanish records, or the nameless captive at the edge of the fire. He was the one who could talk to both sides, who could trade words for shelter and stories for food. The Karankawa offered him a rattle made of turtle shell and turquoise chips, a token of respect. The Spaniards did not understand its meaning, but Estevanico did. He was being marked as someone who belonged to the land, not just the people who claimed to own him. The power of that rattle was not in the sound it made, but in what it represented. With it, Estevanico could walk into a new village and be recognized as a healer, not a threat. He could ask questions others could not. He could choose which truths to tell and which to keep for himself. He could become the story, instead of just another line in someone else's account book. But with every new privilege came new risk. The more the Spaniards relied on him, the more they resented his independence. The more the indigenous peoples trusted him, the more they expected him to protect them from Spanish greed. There were nights when Estevanico lay awake, listening to the wind move through the grass, wondering if he had become too visible. He knew that the chain he wore was now hidden under layers of new identity, but it was still there. He could not afford to be careless. He told himself that survival was still the goal, but something else had begun to grow, a sense that he could shape more than just his own fate. If he could be the one everyone needed, maybe he could finally choose his own path. But the world was not finished testing him. As the seasons changed, the Spanish survivors grew restless. They wanted more than safety. They wanted a way back to power, to gold, to the lives they had lost. Cabeza de Vaca began to dream of escape, of reaching Spanish settlements somewhere to the south. Estevanico saw the longing in their eyes, the hunger for old certainties. He knew that the next move would not be his alone to make. He faced a choice: remain in the fragile peace he had built, or risk everything by leading the survivors on a journey into the unknown. The stakes were higher than ever. If he succeeded, he could become more than a legend. If he failed, the world would remember him as nothing more than a name carved into a broken ship's log. What happened next nearly cost him everything. The struggle did not begin with a single test, but with a series of choices that would have broken most men long before the desert was even a rumor. The first real trial came in the endless scrublands west of the Mississippi. It was winter, the kind that makes your bones ring like bells. Estevanico and the three other survivors, Cabeza de Vaca, Dorantes, Castillo, had broken away from the Karankawa, desperate to escape starvation and slavery. They stumbled into a land where cold bit through every layer, and the sky pressed down with a silence that felt like a threat. One night, as frost crept into their lungs, Dorantes whispered, "We will die if we do not find people soon." Estevanico listened to the wind, trying to remember the names for stars in three languages: Berber, Spanish, and the words he'd begun to learn from the tribes along the way. The group's food was gone. The only way out was forward. So Estevanico led them along deer trails laced with the tracks of strangers. When dawn broke, they found themselves surrounded by a hunting party from a new tribe, bows drawn, faces painted for war. For a heartbeat, nobody breathed. Then Estevanico stepped forward, raised his empty hands, and spoke in the few words he'd learned. "We are lost, hungry, friends." There was a long pause. One of the hunters, older, with a feather in his braid, nodded and lowered his bow. They were taken in, fed, but watched with suspicion. The message was clear: one mistake, and they would vanish like those before them. Survival was now a day-to-day negotiation, and every word mattered. After months of careful diplomacy, Estevanico faced a different threat, one that came from his own side. In the spring of 1530, as they moved west into the lands of the Coihuiltecan people, the balance among the four survivors began to crack. Dorantes and Castillo, stripped of their old ranks, resented how much the indigenous groups trusted Estevanico. Cabeza de Vaca saw it too and kept his doubts close. The Spanish had started to whisper behind Estevanico's back, wondering aloud if he had gone native. One night, Dorantes confronted him beside a dying campfire. "Do not forget who owns you," he hissed, voice tight with cold and fear. Estevanico did not answer, but he watched how the others measured his every move after that. The next day, a group from a neighboring band approached, asking Estevanico to interpret their needs to the rest of the survivors. He did, translating with careful precision, but when the meeting ended, Dorantes accused him of hiding information. "You could lead us anywhere." Dorantes spat, "and we would not know until it was too late." The threat hung in the air. Estevanico realized he was walking an impossible line, trusted by no one, needed by everyone. But he saw a grim opportunity too. If both sides watched him so closely, he could control what they saw. He began to ration the truth, telling each side just enough to keep himself indispensable. The risk was enormous. One wrong move and he would be alone again. Yet with every successful negotiation, his legend grew, and the line between servant and leader blurred a little more. Summer brought a different kind of trial. the land itself. As the group pushed into the arid stretches near what is now Chihuahua, water became the enemy. The rivers dried to pale threads, animals vanished, and the sun felt like it was trying to erase them from the earth. Estevanico scouted ahead, searching for signs of water, reading the flight of birds and the curl of brittle grass. Twice he led the party to dry creek beds, only to find nothing but cracked mud. The third time, he noticed a column of ants marching in a line toward a stand of mesquite. He followed them, dug at the roots, and felt cool dampness rising from below. Using hollow reeds, he showed the others how to draw water from the earth. Castillo laughed for the first time in weeks. "You have desert eyes," he said, but the relief did not last. Days later, a sandstorm swept across their camp, blotting out the sun and choking the air. Supplies vanished overnight. Estevanico wrapped his tunic around his head and crawled from one survivor to the next, making sure nobody suffocated or wandered into the void. When the storm cleared, half their food was gone. He stared at the empty packs and understood nature would kill them just as quickly as any enemy. That night, he knotted a strip of cloth around his wrist, 3 colors, like the flags he remembered from Azemur, reminding himself that adaptation was his only weapon. The next ordeal came not from hunger or thirst, but from the changing expectations of those who followed them. By autumn, word of the group's survival had spread from camp to camp. Tribes sent scouts to see the black foreigner who healed with song and touch. One evening, a chief from the Jumano people invited Estevanico to his fire. The chief's son had been bitten by a spider and lay shivering with fever. The tribe's own healers had failed. "If you save him, you will walk in safety," the chief said. "If you fail, you will not leave this place." The math was simple and brutal. Estevanico knelt beside the boy, recalling the bitter plants his mother used for fevers. He chewed the leaves, spat them into his palm, and rubbed the mixture onto the wound, singing in a low voice. The night crawled by. At dawn, the boy's fever broke. The chief placed a turquoise bead in Estevanico's hand. "You are touched by power," the chief said. From then on, Estevanico was greeted with gifts and requests everywhere they went. Each new tribe expected miracles. If he succeeded, they gave him tokens, shells, beads, feathers. If he failed, suspicion returned. The pressure mounted with every step. He learned to read not just words but silences, and to sense when awe was about to turn back into fear. The weight of expectation threatened to crush him, but he could not stop. The legend was outpacing the man. Not every encounter was peaceful. In the high plains of what would become Sonora, the group met a band who believed the Spanish were spirits sent to steal their souls. The air was thick with suspicion. Estevanico was sent ahead with a feathered gourd, a symbol of healing, but also in some places a sign of sorcery. The headman refused their approach. "Your people bring sickness," he said, pointing at the Spaniards. "We have seen what follows you." Estevanico listened, waited, then sat down and offered to share food. He began to tell a story in broken dialect, weaving together pieces from every culture he knew. How the wind brought travelers, how strangers could become kin. The headman listened, unmoved at first, but when Estevanico recited a prayer his mother used to say, the old man's eyes shifted. Later, the group was allowed to pass, but only after Estevanico performed a ritual with smoke and song. As they left, Cabeza de Vaca asked, "What did you promise them?" Estevanico answered simply that we would not stay. The lesson was clear. Sometimes you survive by making yourself the least dangerous thing in the room. Betrayal was never far behind. By the following year, the Spanish survivors, now ragged and desperate, began to plot their own escape from dependence on Estevanico. Dorantes, emboldened by a new alliance with a local war chief, attempted to barter Estevanico's service for food and safe passage. "Take him," Dorantes offered. "He can bring you rain." The chief considered, then shook his head. "He belongs to the land now, not to you." Estevanico heard every word. That night he sat apart from the others, turning the turquoise bead over in his palm. He understood that his value had become dangerous. If the Spanish saw him as a rival and the indigenous groups saw him as a spirit, he was alone in both worlds. Yet he also saw that neither side could quite let him go. It was a kind of power, but it felt like standing on a knife's edge. The journey's pace quickened as they neared the edge of familiar territory. In early 1536, scouts from Culiac N, a Spanish outpost, heard rumors of a black healer leading a procession of hundreds. Estevanico, now dressed in a patchwork of gifts from different tribes, walked at the front, surrounded by people who believed he could call rain or speak for the spirits. When the group finally reached the outpost, the Spanish soldiers stared, unsure what to make of the man at the center. One officer, Don Melchor Diaz, stepped forward and demanded, "Who leads you?" Before anyone else could speak, the indigenous followers pointed to Estevanico. For a moment, the Spaniards hesitated, then opened the gates. Inside, Estevanico was given a seat at the table, not as property, but as an honored guest. The other survivors, Cabeza de Vaca, Dorantes Castillo, watched him closely. They understood what had happened, even if they did not like it. The man who had arrived in chains was now the key to every negotiation. Watching Estevanico heal his first patient using borrowed roots and remembered song, you can almost feel the ground shift beneath him. If that moment left you wondering how much of freedom is skill and how much is belief, let me know in the comments. When the gates of Culiacan finally swung open, nobody recognized the man at the center of the crowd. At first, the Spanish soldiers saw only a procession of indigenous families trailing behind a tall, dark-skinned figure wrapped in ribbons, beads, and a mantle stitched with patterns they had never seen. But then someone gasped. The face beneath the feathered headdress was familiar, though it hardly belonged to the same Estevanico who had left Spain in chains. He was changed, stripped of the old uniform of servitude, surrounded now by people who watched him with the kind of cautious awe usually reserved for priests or kings. He stepped forward, turquoise rattle in hand, and the hush that followed was not the silence of fear, but of anticipation. Something was different. The officers glanced at each other, searching for the old boundaries, but none of them seemed to fit. For the first time, Estevanico walked under his own name, and when he spoke, both the Spanish and the indigenous leaders listened. This was the moment he had been building toward, though none of his companions could see it coming. Survival for 8 years had meant more than not dying. It had meant watching, adapting, and learning to move through the cracks left by disaster. Estevanico had watched the world's rules collapse, and then he had started to write new ones. He had made himself the only one who could talk to everyone, the only one who could read the silences between languages, the only one trusted to negotiate food, shelter, and peace where swords failed. Each tribe they met on the long walk west had its own customs, its own ways of measuring power. Estevanico learned them all, sometimes by listening for days before speaking, sometimes by risking a story or a song at just the right moment. The Karankawa called him a healer, the Coawiltican people called him a trader, others called him a spirit, a walker between worlds. The Spanish called him when they needed a miracle. Each name was a tool, each mask another layer of armor. He had not set out to become a myth, but when he saw how people responded to the turquoise rattle, how the sound of it could settle an argument or open a door, he understood what it meant to be more than a man. He never claimed to be more than he was, but he never denied it either. When chiefs handed him shells and beads, when mothers pressed sick children into his arms, when warriors asked him to bless their arrows, he accepted the role they gave him. Sometimes he wondered if it was luck, or the echo of his mother's prayers, or simply the hunger in everyone's eyes for something, someone they could believe in. He learned to carry himself with the certainty of someone who belonged everywhere and nowhere at once. Inside the governor's hall at Culiacan, the Spanish officers tried to reassert their old authority. They questioned, demanded, threatened, but even they could see that the power in the room had shifted. Cabeza de Vaca, Dorantes, Castillo, they all told their stories describing the hunger, the storms, the endless death. But when the officers turned to Estevanico, he spoke of the languages he had learned, the tribes he had met, the medicines he had seen. He described rivers with no names in Spanish, mountains whose peaks glowed blue in the evening, and people whose memory stretched further than any map. He did not beg, he did not boast, he simply recited what he knew, and the room listened because nobody else could have survived to tell it. It was not just the Spanish who recognized what had happened. The indigenous families who had followed Estevanico for weeks across the desert waited outside the settlement, refusing to leave until he emerged again. Some came forward to offer gifts: turquoise beads, feathered gourds, rattles, bowls carved with stories. Others came for blessings or to ask for news of relatives lost to war or famine. Estevanico spoke to each in their own language, never raising his voice, always letting his presence do half the work. The old lines, master and slave, Spaniard and native, outsider and kin, blurred beneath the weight of what he had become. The Spanish officers, seeing this, began to argue among themselves. If they treated him as property, they risked offending the tribes who now saw him as sacred. If they treated him as an equal, they broke their own rules. For days, the question hung in the air: who exactly had returned from the wilderness? The answer came in the form of a summons from Mexico City. Viceroy Mendoza wanted to hear the story firsthand. Word had spread that a black man from Africa, once a slave, had crossed the continent on foot, survived where armies had failed, and returned with stories of cities richer than any in Spain. The survivors were sent south under escort, but it was Estevanico whom people watched most closely. Along the way, more villages sent envoys, sometimes to test him, sometimes to honor him. In one valley, a group of elders asked him to interpret a dream. In another, a midwife invited him to witness a naming ceremony. Each time, Estevanico accepted with humility, but inside he felt the old fear receding. The chain around his ankle was gone, replaced by a string of beads and the weight of 100 different expectations. When they entered the capital, the city was boiling with rumors. Some said the lost explorers had returned with news of gold. Others whispered about a healer who could call down rain. The Spanish authorities tried to control the story, but they could not control Estevanico. At the Viceroy's palace, Mendoza demanded an account. Estevanico stood before the most powerful man in the colony and told what he had seen: the vastness of the land, the strength of the people, the treasures and dangers beyond the known world. He answered every question, switching languages as needed, never missing a detail. When Mendoza asked how he had learned so much, Estevanico smiled and said, "By listening." The Viceroy nodded, perhaps recognizing that this was not the answer of a servant. It was the answer of someone who had learned to survive by becoming indispensable. The Spanish survivors, Cabeza de Vaca, Dorantes, Castillo, were honored and sent back to Spain as heroes. Estevanico was not sent home. Instead, Mendoza offered him a new position: guide, advanced scout, and interpreter for the next great expedition. This was not freedom, not in the legal sense, but it was something more powerful. He was being asked to lead, not follow. To go north, ahead of the priests and soldiers, to find the fabled 7 cities of Cibola. The world that had once closed in around him was opening up, and Estevanico stepped through the gap, unafraid. Before he left, the Viceroy's advisors tried to warn him. They reminded him that the Spanish crown still claimed him as property. They cautioned that the desert was unforgiving, that the tribes to the north were unknown, that the legends of gold had swallowed better men. Estevanico listened, but inside he was already beyond their reach. He had survived the Atlantic, the hurricanes, the hunger, the betrayals. He had walked through a continent and emerged not just alive, but transformed. Now, he was being trusted with the hopes of an empire. On the day he set out with Fray Marcos de Niza, Estevanico, dressed not in Spanish rags, but in the regalia given to him by the people he had helped. He wore feathers in his hair, turquoise at his neck, and carried the sacred rattle, its sound echoing across the sand. As they moved north, he traveled ahead of the main party, surrounded by indigenous allies who trusted him to speak for them. At each new village, Estevanico was greeted with respect, sometimes even with reverence. Chiefs met him at the edge of their territory, offering gifts, listening to his stories, asking for news of distant relatives. Children watched from behind their mothers, hoping for a glimpse of the man who could sing away illness and promise safe passage. He was no longer just the interpreter. He was the one who decided what to say, what to withhold, which dangers to warn about, and which opportunities to pursue. When local leaders asked for Spanish goods, Estevanico negotiated the trades himself. When disputes arose, he settled them. When a village feared Spanish intentions, it was Estevanico who calmed them with familiar words and gestures. He could move between camps at night without fear, trusted by people who would have killed any other foreigner. He was the advance party, the first face of the New World, and everyone, Spanish and indigenous alike, knew it. The further north he traveled, the more the myth grew. By the time he reached the lands of the Zuni, Estevanico was traveling with an entourage of hundreds. Some came out of curiosity, others out of hope, some in awe. They sang songs about the healer who had crossed the great waters, the man who could speak with the dead, the one who brought news from faraway lands. When he sent word ahead, it was not as a servant of Spain, but as someone announcing his own arrival. He sent symbolic gifts, a gourd, a feather, a rattle, all signs that meant something different to each group, but all pointed back to him. At Hawiku, the fabled city of Cibola, Estevanico approached the gates not as a conqueror, but as an envoy. The Zuni watched from the rooftops, uncertain how to receive a man who seemed both familiar and terrifying. He entered alone, carrying only the sacred rattle and the stories he had gathered over a lifetime. What happened next would be debated for centuries, but for a brief, blinding moment. Estevanico stood at the center of three worlds, African, Spanish, and indigenous, and all eyes were on him. He had crossed a continent, survived the impossible, and invented himself anew at every turn. The boy from Azemur, sold in a market and baptized in cold water, had become the man who walked ahead of empires, who spoke in tongues no other explorer could master, who made the powerful listen and the fearful hope. The man who had started as a name on an inventory list now moved at the front of the line, his turquoise rattle shimmering in the sun, a legend carried forward by every step. To understand what Estevanico's story leaves behind, you have to look past the obvious and see the shape of the gap he filled. In a world where most people were sorted and stamped at birth, he slipped the net by becoming what everyone else needed, even when they did not know it yet. The secret was never just his survival or even his ability to pick up a language in a week or to make strangers trust his hands to heal their children. It was his instinct to read the shifting winds of power and rewrite the script before anyone else noticed the stage had changed. When disaster tore apart the old rules, Estevanico did not just adapt, he invented new ones. It is one thing to outlive a storm, another to walk out of the wreckage with a new name, new skills, and a following of people who see you as something almost sacred. The lesson is not about the miracle of endurance, but about the deeper miracle of transformation. When you realize that nobody will ever hand you a place at the table, so you build your own and make others gather around it. The turquoise rattle was never just a trinket. It was a signal, a claim to space in a world that wanted to keep him invisible. Estevanico's legacy is not measured by maps or monuments, but by the way he forced the world to widen its categories. Conquistadors, priests, and tribal elders, none could decide if he was a servant, a savior, or a sorcerer. And in that confusion he found his freedom. He showed that the boundaries between cultures, between the seen and the unseen, between power and powerlessness are thinner than anyone wants to admit. Every time he crossed a river or stepped into a new language, he reminded those watching that survival is not about clinging to a single identity, but about becoming fluent in change itself. People who were supposed to own him ended up relying on his knowledge, his judgment, his reputation. Those who expected him to simply disappear into the background found themselves asking what he saw, what he understood, what he could do that they could not. The world remembers heroes who break the rules, but Estevanico's real magic was spotting the loopholes in the first place. He made himself indispensable by carrying stories and skills across borders nobody else could cross. In the end, his myth outlasted the men who tried to keep him in chains, and his legend still flickers in the places where cultures meet and history forgets to draw hard lines. When the world seems locked down by someone else's story, remember Estevanico's turquoise rattle, a sound that says, in any language, you can become more than what you are called. Somewhere out beyond the reach of maps, a turquoise rattle catches the last light of day, its sound drifting over the sand as if it might summon rain or memory or the next impossible story. The man who walks ahead leaves no chain behind him, only footprints that refuse to fade. Estevanico's story is proof that the world's boundaries are never as fixed as they seem. If someone handed you their chains but called you healer, which truth would you choose to live by? Share what this story changes for you, or just sit with it a moment before you move on.